Having reached the furthest west point of the public road at the Linn of Dee, we will continue west on the tracks that lead on up through Glen Dee and Glen Geldy. We will pass the settlements at Craigfatrick, Dalvorer and Dubrach, look at the White Bridge over the River Dee at the foot of the Larrigrue and the nearby suspension bridge over the River Geldy, and Sheelings at Altenshonach, before arriving at Lower Geldy Lodge, where we are only a short distance from Bynnock Lodge. In 1780, Cordiner described the settlement at Craigfatrick as follows. A singular craggy hill that attracts one's notice is called Craigfatrick. At the foot of the waterfall, which plays down the steep for 50 or 60 yards, there is a rural bridge composed of broken trees and sods, which lead the way to some cottages that are sheltered by the rock. The peasants that inhabit them cultivate a meadowy plain, which stretches thence to the Dee. These dwellings, from their very artless form and wicker enclosures, scarcely seem to diminish the wildness, but add to the beauty of the landscape. All that remains of Craigfatrick today. There were two holdings at Dalvorer, which were held in 1786 by Donald Mackenzie and James MacGregor. By 1803, these holdings had been taken over by a Charles MacHardy, who also rented the lands of Bynnock and Corryvron. In 1817, Charles MacHardy was reduced to having Dalvorer and Dubrach, while Bynnock and Corryvron had been taken over by a William Gordon. I think that both of them were sheep farmers. During the Muckle Spate in August 1829, the tenant of Dalvorer, his wife and 7 children, escaped from their house by wading and made their way to seek shelter in Inverrye. The whole of his crop and 11 acres of arable land were destroyed. After the 1745 Jacobite uprising, the Hanoverians placed a detachment of a sergeant, a corporal and 12 men at Dubrach. In 1749, the man in charge of that military detachment was Sergeant Arthur Davies, whose grave we have previously seen at the head of Glen Christie. At that time, the farm was tenanted by Michael Farquharson. In 1786, the tenant at Dubrach was Peter Grant, and he had been captured at the Battle of Culloden, but subsequently escaped from Carlisle Castle while awaiting trial, living on to the ripe old age of 110. He was known as Auld Dubrach. By 1832, all leases in Glen Dee were ended and not renewed, marking the cessation of all farming in the glen above the Linn of Dee. The White Bridge was built here sometime before 1866 to replace a footbridge and ford, which were located a little further downstream. This suspension bridge spanned the River Geldy near the White Bridge, but was in a dilapidated condition by the 1950s, and I guess it was demolished in the 1960s. These are Sheelings in Corryvron on the banks of the Altenshonach Burn, on the east side of the River Geldy, about halfway between the White Bridge and Lower Geldy Lodge. In 1803, Corryvron was leased as grazing by the tenants of Dalvorer, further down the glen. In the early days, the Earl of Fife had a shield about 1 mile beyond the White Bridge, which may have been on this site. There was no lodge here in 1861, when Queen Victoria went through the tilt. So Lower Geldy Lodge was built after 1861 and was extended in 1896 and remained in use until 1914. This footbridge spanned the River Geldy at Lower Geldy Lodge, and it was kept in serviceable condition until the early 1960s, after which it was abandoned to its fate. A cottage was built at Bynnock in 1838. A stable and byre were added in 1840, and in 1844 the cottage received a slated roof. Trees were planted around the cottage to provide some shelter. It was enlarged in 1896 and in use until 1914. Standing at the back of the photo, which was taken at Bynnock Lodge in 1910, are the coachman from the Fife Arms Hotel and Mr. MacDonald, a long-serving keeper on the Mar estate. In the middle row are Mr. MacDonald's family, his daughter Jean, his wife Jane MacHardy, his daughter Helen and son Sandy. The man with the stick is the Grieve from Coich Farm. Seated in front is Mr. MacDonald's son Donald. The dog's name is unknown. We have already met Donald and Sandy, who were in the photo of the Mar Lodge staff taken outside the Stag Ballroom in 1930, when the boys were in their 20s. His daughter Helen was known locally as Bainoch Nell, and she was staying at Louisbeg Cottage when a Zeppelin flew over the area in the First World War. Here we are at the entrance to the Tilt Pass to Blair Athol, which in the early 1900s was closed to walkers by the Duke of Athol. This was not enough to deter the Professor of Botany at Edinburgh University, Baillie Balfour, who passed in defiance of the angry Duke. He was on his way to Ben Macdui to collect a specimen of the grass reputed to be poisonous to horses. The grass was poisoned, legend says, by the Fam, a mythical monster, which appeared only at Loch Anne, only at dawn, and only on the highest verge of the mountain. This event is immortalised in the poem. Balfour he had a mind as weel, as ony duke could hae man. Quo he, there's ne'er a kilted chiel shall drive us back this day, man. It's justice and it's public recht. We'll pass the tilt afore the necht, for Duke shall we, carry Bobby. The road's as free to you and me as to his grace himself, man. And pass he did. It was this event that led to the founding of the Scottish Rights of Way Society. Unfortunately, Bainoch has been allowed to fall into ruin like so many of the other structures on the estate. We continue west from Lower Geldie Lodge, passing Upper Geldie Lodge and the Black Bothy before arriving at the watershed between the rivers Geldie and the River Feshie, where, before we turn back, we will have a quick look at the Etchard Bridge. The photograph shows Geldie Lodge from the south, looking north across Glen Geldie towards the summits of the central Cairngorms. Geldie Lodge was built in 1854 and extended in 1868. It was occupied for about 8 weeks during the shooting season, but its use was short-lived and it was abandoned about 1897. A bothy existed near the head of Glen Geldie in 1696, or soon after, because it is shown on the Farquharson's map of 1703. In 1957, the Scottish Rights of Way Society funded the building of a bridge over the River Etchard, where several climbers had died while trying to cross the swollen river. The bridge was designed by Dr. G.A. Taylor, who also supervised its erection. The Territorial Army provided the labour and 2 jeeps to transport the material to the bridge site. Both jeeps failed to make it, leaving a pile of materials in the middle of the moor to be carried to the bridge. One jeep had burnt out its clutch and had to be pushed all the way back to the White Bridge. We return to the White Bridge and head up the River Dee into the Lara Grue, home of the famous climbers' refuge, Carrower Bothy. There was a deer watcher stationed at Carrower as early as 1866, and the stone hut was built in 1877. One of the watchers here was Charles Robertson from Inverrye. The hut served its original purpose until about 1911, after which it became a refuge for climbers, and by the late 1940s it looked like this. With the approval of the Mar estate, the Cairngorm Club re-roofed it in 1950, using volunteer labour under the supervision of Dr. G.A. Taylor. Ponies and a Bren gun carrier were used to transport the materials, but the mechanised transport could only get part of the way there. Much hand carrying of materials to the site was required. It was a logistical nightmare to get all the necessary materials transported to the bothy, and once work commenced it was found that everything necessary was at hand, except for the felt washers for the drive screws that held on the aluminium roof. All hands were drafted in by George Taylor one evening, and with much grumbling they worked into the small hours of the morning, cutting the necessary washers out of a roll of roofing felt. In the early 1950s, a wire bridge was erected across the River Dee at Carrower, single-handed by an Aberdeen postal worker, Mr. Jack Milne, after a Glasgow climber was swept away and drowned while trying to cross the swollen River Dee, and another collapsed and died from exhaustion. The wire bridge was always an athletic and entertaining way to cross the river. The Nature Conservancy Council funded the construction of 5 new bridges in the Eastern Cairngorms in 1959. They were designed and built by Dr. G. A. Taylor, assisted by his engineering students. This is the new bridge at Carrower, where the handrails were used as scaffolding to assist in getting the heavy main beams lifted to their final position. A helicopter was used to transport the material to the 5 bridge sites, a task which was completed in a single day. Returning to the Linn of Dee, we turn east along a public road on the north side of the River Dee, and soon come to the locked gate at the bottom of the Derry Lodge Road. Here we turn off and follow the Looe Water up to Derry Lodge, passing on the way the Fish Ladder and the ruins of settlements at Achafini. As we enter the Derry Lodge woods, we pass the new Bob Scott's bothy, before coming to Derry Lodge, with Louisbeg Cottage just beyond it. A fish ladder was built in 1950 at the falls on the Looe Water to try and develop the Looe Water as a salmon river. However, it was never a success, and after a few years it was abandoned. The lower part has completely disappeared in recent years. In the charter granted to Kenneth Mackenzie by the Earl of Mar in 1692, the farms in Glenlouis are named as Shealing Grounds, and it was probably first settled shortly thereafter. Here we see the settlements of Easter and Wester Achafini from the air. From 1731 until 1739, the glen had 7 tenants, and after that only 4 tenants until 1776, when the glen was cleared of people. These tenants were all located between the Black Bridge and Derry Lodge. Bob Scott, the keeper at Derry Lodge, ran a world-famous bothy for climbers in his woodshed at Louisbeg Cottage from 1952 until it was destroyed by fire in 1986. Shortly afterwards, a replacement was built by the Mountain Bothies Association at this site on the edge of the Derry Wood. Unfortunately, this bothy was also destroyed by fire in 2003, but was replaced by the current bothy short thereafter. Mention is made of Derry Shealing as early as 1798, but little use seems to have been made of it, and for most of its lifetime it remained empty. It is thought that Thomas Powell, a shooting tenant, may have lived here about 1866, and there was times when it was occupied by a keeper, but no other evidence of occupation has been found. Derry Lodge has been extended several times. It is thought that the brown area was built first as a single-storey building, and subsequently raised to 2 stories. The yellow area was added next, and finally the red area was built to complete the lodge as it is today. This photo of a fishing party outside Derry Lodge was taken in October 1905, with Edward VII standing next to the Duke and Duchess of Fife. Julius Donner was a member of the infamous family of Baron Camoys, and the Duchess of Manchester was a renowned Cuban-American beauty and celebrated society figure who was rumoured to have been the king's mistress at some point. I think the gamekeeper in this picture is Mr. MacDonald, the same gentleman that we saw previously in the photo taken at Bynett Lodge with his family. Derry Lodge was requisitioned by the Army on the 26th of October 1942 to provide accommodation for troops training in mountain warfare. One soldier who trained here recalled that while out on the hills they supplemented their meagre rations by using gun cotton to poison the fish in the river. During the 15-year lease of the lodge by the Cairngorm Club, it was possible to get a key for the gate on the road and drive to Derry Lodge for the price of 2 shillings and 6pence, 12.5 pence in today's money, although a motorbike could slip through the pedestrian access. In 1955, the Cairngorm Club, using volunteer labour, replaced the passage and kitchen at the rear of the premises, which were in a poor condition. The 3 people on the right of this picture are Gordon McAndrew, with back to camera, Bob Still, bending over laying blocks, and the ginger-haired boy is Innes Ewan. In 1956, the estate wanted to increase the rent being paid by the Cairngorm Club for Derry Lodge from £25 per annum to £500 per annum. This was unsustainable, and after 1 year the club gave up the lease. Since then, the lodge has lain empty, gradually acquiring an air of increasing dereliction. Since taking over, the National Trust have made the building watertight, but it has suffered much vandalism internally, and it is now in a very poor condition. This is a very early photograph of cows being milked at Louisbeg Cottage, for many years the home of the gamekeeper on the Derry beat. In 1841, William McHardy, a servant, lived in Louisbeg Cottage with his wife and 4 children. And in 1851, a Peter McHardy, gamekeeper, was there with his wife and 8 children. In 1926, Alexander Grant became the stalker on the Derry beat, and we have met him already in the photo of the staff at Mar Lodge taken outside the Stag Ballroom in 1930. In 1937, his son Ian succeeded him as stalker at Louisbeg, and he was also a piper, accordionist, fiddle player and part-time whisky maker. In 1946, Bob Scott, the monarch of the Derry, came to Louisbeg Cottage and was to stay there until he retired in 1972. We have seen the replacement, but this was the original Scott's bothy, the woodshed behind Louisbeg Cottage. Born in 1903, Bob was one of 11 children of a Mar estate gamekeeper. He left school at the age of 12 when his father died and went to work on the Mar estate as a ponyman, and then as a rifleman, and then a fishing gilly. He served with the Royal Engineers in World War II and spent 3 years in North Africa. After the war, he was stalker at the Lynn for 1 year before moving to Derry Lodge, where he stayed until he retired in 1972. Bob was a fond of stories, and one of my favourites was the day that he was out shooting with a party of guests, and the kill was a record 10 stags. On the same day, 2 climbers died in the Larrigrue. Later, Bob was to describe the events of the day as the best day they ever had in the Derry. 10 stags and 2 Englishmen. Here we have ponies and sledges carrying hay to Derry Lodge in the winter. Leaving Derry Lodge, on the path west to the Larrigrue is the Louisbeg Bridge. And heading north up Glenderry lies the Derry Dam Bridge, just beyond which are found the remains of the Derry Dam. And further on is the site of the Glasshout Bridge. In Corryetchican lies the Hutchison Memorial Hut, on the route to Ben Macdui. As we leave Derry Lodge and head west towards the Larrigrue, the Louisbeg Burn can provide a formidable obstacle when in spate. The original tree trunk and plank bridge over the burn can be seen behind the site of the new bridge. This photo was taken in 1948 during the construction of an all-aluminium bridge as a replacement, the work being done by William Taws and Sons under the supervision of Dr. G. A. Taylor at the behest of the Cairngorm Club. The new bridge was built on the line of the path and had 6 feet 6 inches clearance above normal water level, which was thought would be above the level reached by the water even in heavy spate conditions. A snow-covered Ben Macdui is in the background. In August 1956, a storm of exceptional severity hit the Cairngorms, washing the bridge 100 yards downstream. In the course of this flood, the river changed its channel above the bridge and left the floor of the valley as a wilderness of boulders. The flood also washed away the access bridge to Louisbeg Cottage and damaged both the Black Bridge and the Canadian Bridge. In 1957, the Cairngorm Club re-erected the Louisbeg Bridge using volunteer labour on a new site about 250 metres upstream, where there were solid rock foundations and an even higher clearance above the normal water level. As we leave Derry Lodge and head north up Glenderry, in about 1¼ miles the path crossed the Derry Burn on this old and badly sagging tree trunk and plank bridge. Note the props holding the bridge up near the centre. This was another of the 5 bridges funded by the Nature Conservancy Council in 1959. The work was carried out by Dr. George A. Taylor and his engineering students. Since the time that the Mackenzies had the Dalmore estate, timber was floated down the River Derry, and just upstream from the Derry Dam Bridge are the remains of the Derry Dam, which was used to create an artificial flood to carry the logs downstream. The tenants of the estate were at certain times of the year able to pick up casual work as floaters to earn some extra money. In 1760, as many as 18 men were employed in any one day floating timber. Another of the 5 bridges constructed in 1959 was across the Glassop Moor, a tributary which enters the Derry Burn just before the path turns off to Corryetchican. However, this bridge only lasted a few years before it was washed away. It has never been replaced. In 1954, the Etchican Club organised the building of a hut in Corryetchican in the memory of one of their members who was killed in a climbing accident. The work was carried out by W. J. Brown, builders of Aberdeen, under the supervision of Dr. George A. Taylor. Unfortunately, the Etchican hut gained a reputation as being a cold, miserable place even in summer. In 2012, the hut was extensively renovated by the Mountain Bothies Association. This is the unveiling ceremony for the indicator on the summit of Ben Macdui, which was erected by the Cairngorm Club in 1925. Returning to the public road at the Derry Road Gate, we continue east, across the bridge over the Louis Water, and we enter the Dalmore, Gaelic for the Big Hoch, which over time has been corrupted to Delmore or Dalmore. The settlements in the Dalmore in the early 1700s are shown on the map. In 1692, Kenneth Mackenzie of Dalmore had 3 servants and 36 tenants in Dalmore, whereas the Laird of Inverrye only had 7 servants and 35 tenants on the Inverrye estate. So in 1692, more people lived in the north side of the river than on the south side. The tenants in the Dalmore were cleared as the Old Mar Lodge property expanded, leaving the situation that we have today, where most people live on the south side of the river. Dalmore Lodge was situated where the stables of Newmar Lodge are now located. Note that there is no bridge across the River Dee, because at the time this map was drawn, the main road up Glen Dee was on the north side of the river, all the way from Invercauld. This is the house that the Mackenzies had at Dalmore when they sold out to Lord Bracco in 1739. Note that it is a 2-storey dwelling. In this picture, taken about 150 years later, the house looks very similar to the one in the last picture, only now it is 3 stories tall and has had a semicircular tower added to the centre of the facade. The Duff Highlanders parade in front of Old Mar Lodge. Another photograph of Old Mar Lodge, still the same building. In 1775, the 2nd Earl of Fife built a Gothic tower on the hill of Cragan, which became an obvious feature, welcoming guests to the grounds of Mar Lodge. Here we see the tower from somewhere near Allanacoich. The Duke of Fife built the present lodge in 1895 after he had married Princess Louise, and in 1903 it looked like this. After the death of the Duchess of Fife, in 1959, when Captain Ramsay inherited the estate, he had to sell the part of the estate north of the River Dee to pay off the death duties, and by 1962 it belonged to the Swiss family of John and Gerald Pancho. They ran the estate as a commercial sporting venture and the lodge as a hotel. Vehicle tracks were constructed throughout the estate, including one leading close to the summit of Benavuord, constructed for a proposed skiing development. 2 ski lifts were installed on the hill behind Mar Lodge, and the success of the venture depended entirely on their ability to produce artificial snow. This was a total failure, and the lifts only operated on a handful of occasions before the venture was abandoned. Eventually the lifts were sold to the Glenshee Chairlift Company, and one of them still serves today as the lift onto north end of the Cairnwell Ridge, known as the Cairnwell T-Bar. On the 2nd of April 1967, Aberdeen Ski Club, in collaboration with the Marlodge Estate, held their annual ski races at Benavoord. They transported the skiers and a rope tow to the site in tractors and trailers. You can see the road that was bulldozed up Benavoord below and running across the face of the ridge on the right of the photograph. In the 1980s, Captain Ramsay sold the part of the Mar estate west of the valley of the River Eye to the Pancho brothers, so the Marlodge estate now looks like this. The Lloyd's insurance underwriting crash in the mid-1980s accelerated the buying and selling of huge tracts of land in Scotland. The 41,000 acres of Glenanne went to a Malaysian, and the 48,000 acres of Curragher to a Swedish packaging heiress. Egg was sold by a rally driver to an eccentric German artist, but ended up in the public domain. During this massive land sale, John Kluge, an American millionaire, bought Marlodge on Deeside in 1989 for a new wife, who promptly left him. He ran the estate for sporting purposes. Renovation of the lodge was interrupted by a fire in 1991 and finally completed in 1993. When you visit the lodge today, it is hard to believe that it ever looked like this. This is the reconstructed lodge today, looking as good as it ever did. In 1995, the estate was sold to the National Trust for Scotland, who generate income from the lease of the building for functions or as a group of apartments which can be leased individually. Leaving Marlodge, we return to the public road behind it and travel east to the car park at the road end, just short of the bridge over the River Coich. Beyond the bridge lies the modern farm of Allanacoich. This is what Allanacoich looked like in 1745 after Lord Bracco had acquired the Allanacoich estate from the Farquharsons. There are two settlements marked on the map, Allanacoich and Canachail. The Poll Book of 1696 shows that there were 4 tenants and 12 subtenants in the two settlements, so at that time there were 16 households in this area. By 1803, Allanacoich had been consolidated into one unit and leased to James Stewart, the Earl of Mar's factor. In 1841, there were 27 people in 4 family groups living at Allanacoich, including 12 children below the age of 10. In 1872, there were 10 tenants and 8 subtenants, including a tailor, a weaver and a packman. In 1891, there were still 4 family groups, but only 15 people. These tenants had shieling rights in Glenderry and Glencoich. Just west of the Allanacoich settlement on the River Coich are a sawmill on the east bank in the Allanacoich estate and a meal mill on the west bank in the Dalmore estate. The Allanacoich estate has always had substantial woodlands, which accounts for the presence of the sawmill, which was established in 1695. The timber from the upper reaches of the Coich was floated down to the mill. A second sawmill was established high up the glen in 1797 to deal with larger logs, but this had fallen into disuse by 1826. Here is the 1901 map for the same area, and the sawmill is still there. There is now a very high, steep bank straight up from the river where the meal mill used to be. One can only conclude that the river has changed its course slightly and eradicated all trace of the mill. At the site of the sawmill, the pit for the mill wheel and the tail race to carry the water back to the river are still clearly visible today. 200 metres above the site of the mills lies the Linn of Coich and the Earl of Mar's punch bowl. After the traditional stag hunt in the autumn of 1715, It was here that the Earl of Mar and his friends gathered together to drink a brew of whisky, honey, and boiling water, prepared by the servants in the hollow in the rock. His amazed friends were told of his latest change of political view. He said that although he had previously supported the union of the Parliaments, he had now changed his mind and was determined to undo the cursed union and make Scotland free again, so that they could enjoy their ancient liberties. A few days later, he raised his standard of rebellion at Braemar. The Linn of Coich was the favourite place for Princess Louise to take guests at Mar Lodge for a picnic. A cottage was built in which was kept all of the paraphernalia necessary for a royal picnic, and it became known as the Coich Tea Room. Since the National Trust took over the estate, they have made the Coich Tea Room wind and watertight. There was a deer watcher's bothy in the Dew Glen 4 miles further upstream, and a deer watcher was stationed there during the summer months to keep track of the herds of deer and to deter unwanted visitors, such as poachers and hill walkers. Sandy MacDonald was the watcher here in 1894. The Muckle Spate of 1829 did extensive damage to the farmland at Allanacoich, which was inundated with gravel over the most part of it, in places up to 8 feet deep. The tenant, Charles Cumming, could get no income from the ground, but remained on a reduced rent. In 1831, substantial new bulwarks were built to protect the farm. John Hunter was the tenant from 1857 till 1867. Then it passed to George Clark, a sheep farmer. It then went to the Fife Arms Hotel in Braemar until 1912, after which the estate ran it themselves. In 1743, Lord Bracco began an ambitious scheme in cooperation with Farquharson of Invercald to drain the marshy parts of the Hoch, which stretches all the way to Braemar, and to protect it from flooding by the Dee. The part of the Hoch in Allanacoich was known as the Black Ward or Black Park. They dug several miles of open ditches and built bulwarks along the bank of the river. The plan was to grow flax on the improved land, but it never happened, and the land was apportioned to the tenants of Allanacoich. We finish with 2 stalwart lady members of the Braemar WRI, who lived in the vicinity of Allanacoich and who faced a 6-mile cycle trip by the Linn of Dee to get to meetings in Braemar. They were Mrs. Mackintosh and Mrs. MacDougall, and they were known as the Mrs. Macs. They kept a rowing boat down by the River Dee, and providing that the river level was not too high, they cycled down to the boat, loaded the bikes, rowed across the river, and hauled their bikes up the far bank onto the Linn of Dee road. This cut the distance of their journey in half. To return home, they reversed the route, often by torchlight in the dark. It must have been quite a challenge to get the latest batch of fairy cakes undamaged to the WRI meeting, so that they still stood a chance of winning in the competition.